Hi everyone. At the top of this episode, I want to mention that this episode discusses people who were accused of crimes, some who were tried and acquitted, and it does discuss the full scope of the investigation. At the time of this recording, nobody has been found guilty for the murder of Cliff Nelson, and all parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Almost every school has one, that teacher that stands out as the one that both kids and colleagues gravitate towards. To say they go above and beyond seems kind of cliche, but it's true. And beyond that, they just find a way to connect differently, engage learners, build trust and rapport, and show genuine care for the students they teach and love for the job they do. I can still vividly picture some of my favorite teachers who did that for me. And that's the kind of teacher the tiny town of Sealy Lake, Montana had. That was until one night, he was fatally gunned down in his home. Within just a week, suspects would be arrested, but between an acquittal and lack of evidence, nobody has ever been found guilty in the case. Rumor has it the town knows who did it, but it has stayed an open secret because everyone's been too terrified to talk. Cold case investigators are taking another shot at the case, and they hope with the passage of time, those who've been afraid will come forward. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the murder of Cliff Nelson. In northeast Missoula County, you'll find the picturesque, unincorporated community of Sealy Lake, Montana. The town is named for the 1,000-acre lake it surrounds. Sealy Lake serves as the northwestern border of the area, and the Clearwater River forms the southwest. The 13-square-mile census-designated area has just 2,200 people living there, people who are drawn to the natural beauty of the Montana wilderness. Montana Highway 83 is the main route that takes you to it and through it. But Sealy Lake does have its own little footprint. It has its own weekly newspaper, the Sealy Swan Pathfinder, and the Sealy Lake branch of the Missoula Public Library. It also has its own school district, and within that school district was a teacher named Mr. Nelson. Cliff Nelson, that is. And if you were lucky enough to have him as your educator, you really hit the jackpot. Clifford Lee Nelson was child number 7 of 8. He was raised on a farm in Foreman, North Dakota. He was a devout Christian, and he was also the first person in his family to graduate college. Cliff picked up and made the 900-mile move west to Missoula County, Montana, and there he found his home teaching at Sealy Lake Elementary School. Cliff was a dedicated teacher who spent nearly 20 years in the district. In his later years, his focus was on 7th and 8th grade, and he left his mark. First of all, he was one of those teachers that just did everything. He taught, he coached, he mentored, he took kids out for dinner. Several newspapers, especially the Missoulian, told little anecdotes about him from students and colleagues and parents. For example, he had a Shakespearean theater club. He was the teacher who organized the 8th grade graduation. If he noticed a student's family didn't have financial resources, he'd buy the kid a pair of sneakers. At one point, he coached the boys and girls varsity basketball teams at the same time. And then he took his extra stipend that he got and he donated it to a former student with music ambitions who was raising money to record an album. Sometimes the students' families, because they were in a rural community, they couldn't commit to driving the kids all the way to practices and games in this greater Missoula area where games would happen, so he would drive them. And often after the games, he'd buy the kids dinner, and he would take this out of his own paycheck. Cliff wasn't married and he didn't have kids of his own. His students were his kids, and he really poured his heart into them and their success. One year, when the 8th graders raised money in excess of what they needed, he convinced them to donate the money versus using it for an end-of-the-year party. Cliff also had a unique interest and area of service. Each summer, he volunteered his time as a ranger at the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument and has been inducted as an honorary member to the Crow Tribe for his service relating to issues facing Congress with regard to the monument. Students would visit him there, and he had impressive knowledge on all the subject matter. Cliff had won Montana Teacher of the Year, but those closest to him said he liked to fly under the radar. He didn't want all the awards or accolades. And former student Peter Blair said to the Missoulian, quote, "He was a great teacher. He showed us the importance of hard work in school, and he emphasized going to college and getting through it," end quote. So at this point, you're probably wondering the obvious. Who could possibly have anything against this man? How did he end up as a case on this podcast? And that's still a question we don't have all the answers to today. But here's what we do know about Cliff's last moments and what came after. On Sunday evening, September 29th, 1996, Cliff Nelson had taken 5 students out to the movies at a place called Cinema 3. After the movie, he took the students to Pizza Hut, where, as usual, he paid for the bill. According to the Missoula County Sheriff's Captain Jerry Crego, he dropped the students back off between 8 and 8:30 p.m., and then he returned to his residence on Redwood Lane. Cliff lived in a small trailer on a wooded property. The area was remote, but there were other neighbors nearby. Sometime between the early morning hours of 1:30 and 2 a.m. on Monday, September 30th, the sound of a shotgun rang out. Neighbors in the Redwood Lane neighborhood phoned 911 for reports of shots fired. Missoula County Sheriff's Deputy Scott Newell responded to the neighborhood, looking for the source of the gunshots. As he drove down the street, he noticed the door to Cliff Nelson's trailer ajar, but he kept driving past it, unsure if it was related or not. When he drove back by a second time and it was still open, he pulled up to the trailer to check on the occupant. There, just inside the trailer, on the floor, was Cliff Nelson. He had been shot in the head, and he was immediately pronounced dead. One thing that was a little interesting was that neighbors heard the shots, but they went on to say that they didn't see anything or anybody suspicious in the neighborhood, and they didn't hear a car leaving the area. In fact, after the shot, a neighbor named Troy Spence actually got out of bed and drove around because he thought there were maybe poachers illegally hunting on the properties. But he didn't see anything. It appeared to authorities that Cliff had awoken to someone entering his trailer, and when he came out to investigate, he was immediately gunned down. They believed the perpetrator or perpetrators stood just inside the doorway to pull the trigger. According to investigators, they got mixed feedback on whether or not Cliff typically locked his doors to his trailer, but what they did observe is that there was no sign of forced entry at the door, so he either left the door unlocked or he opened the door to his killer or killers in some way. Now, if you've been listening to me for a while, you'll know one of my pet peeves is saying that because there's no sign of forced entry, that the victim likely knew the killer and let them in. We know that in many cases that's not the case, and there's a million reasons why someone might let someone in. So reserve your shock when I say, I do think in this case there's a high likelihood that Cliff knew who did this to him. And that's mainly because Cliff was a pillar of this community. He taught just about every student who came through the district. And if you weren't his student, you were maybe someone he coached, or you were the parent of one of his students, and sometimes both over the years. Another thing that is super odd about this night is that the shot that killed Cliff was not the only gunshot that overnight. At Sealy Swan High School, someone had shot through the secretary's window at the main office. This was overnight, so nobody was there and nobody was hurt in that instance, but the window was blown out. But according to Captain Jerry Crego, based on the evidence found at the scene of the high school compared to what was recovered at Cliff Nelson's scene, the two crimes were connected. The shots were determined to be fired from a 12-gauge shotgun. And just for reference, I'll have a map of this on our Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod, but the distance from the high school to Cliff's home was less than a mile away. Based on witness reports of when gunshots were heard, it's believed that the shots at the high school occurred first, followed by the fatal shot to Cliff Nelson just moments later. So, who shot at this specific window at the high school and why? And then, why did they come to Mr. Nelson's trailer and shoot him? Within a few days, investigators started to piece some things together. I want to take a moment to thank you for listening to this week's episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. I've just entered my second year of podcasting, and I'm looking forward to doing big things this year. Please help me spread the word about the podcast and these cold cases by leaving a 5-star review, subscribing, and interacting with the podcast on social media. It really helps people find the show. Case suggestions can be made to me at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. And you guys have come through big. I have so many written down now, and some listener-requested episodes are already in progress. I'm also looking to partner with families as much as possible to tell their loved ones' stories, because I just feel that the stories are so much more complete in that format. So, if that's you or someone you know, send them my way. Now, back to the show. Word of the popular teacher's murder spread fast. Cliff Nelson was just 49 years old, and the community was devastated. Clearly, someone went there and wanted him dead, but the greater Missoula community took this like a punch to the gut. Crowds of students pulled together to memorialize their teacher and spoke to the local papers. A couple of days after the murder, on October 2nd, 1996, a memorial service was held for Cliff Nelson. You'll remember that the town at this time had just over 2,200 residents, and 1,200 showed up for his memorial. One parent remembered the impact a first day of school activity had on her son. Mr. Nelson had told the students on the first day of school that every single time this happens, he sees a classroom full of new faces, but he also sees the ghosts of students who left impressions. And then he asked those students if they were going to be students who left impressions on him. And that made her son go on a mission, in a good way, I assume, to leave an impression on Cliff Nelson. That same student also recalled how he later had submitted writing in a professional capacity, and he decided to wait to submit and go back and correct it because he realized his conclusion wasn't strong enough, and he knew Mr. Nelson wouldn't have approved. As I said at the top of this episode, I had a couple of teachers like this, and they still live rent-free in my head in the best of ways. It just really goes to show you how a teacher can leave a mark on a student's life, how they can be this uplifting or safe space, and sometimes they don't even realize the impact they're having in real time. At the memorial, 2 girls in basketball uniforms discussed their teacher and coach and said, quote, "He's changed our lives already." And they then said they were dedicating their season to him, but, quote, "The memories of our coach will make it hard to concentrate," end quote. According to reporting in the Missoulian, student after student shared how Mr. Nelson was more than just a teacher to them. One student even said, quote, "God help us to get through each and every day without him," end quote. I can't imagine how painful it was for these students who did find Cliff Nelson as their safe space teacher. If that had happened to one of mine, I'd find it difficult to cope as well. One parent said to the paper, "He had the ability to make everyone feel special because to him, everyone was special. It's hard to talk about him. It almost feels like no one can understand our grief because he was so much a part of us. He was an individual you trusted with your children. The shock is just overwhelming," end quote. Maybe the sweetest anecdote of all was from a handwritten note a student had tacked to a bulletin board addressed to Cliff Nelson's mother. It read, quote, "He makes us laugh at everything. I will always have something in my heart that he gave to me. Well, I just wanted to write to you to tell you how much I loved and cared for your son. I will always keep that love too. Your friend, Jessie." Maybe even sweeter was the fact that Cliff Nelson's family traveled to Montana for the memorial. Cliff was to be buried back in the family cemetery in North Dakota, and another funeral would be held there. But his older brother Orville told the whole Montana community that they were welcome to join, and that that family in Montana was like a family to Cliff, and that between the siblings and their family, they would put up any visitors and welcome them with open arms. Just a few days after the murder, on Friday, October 4th, Missoula County Sheriff's detectives dropped a bombshell. They said they were questioning 2 suspects who were former students of Mr. Nelson's. And then they made another bold statement. They said that they believed they had enough probable cause to arrest them. The only thing holding them back was if they had enough to bring them to trial and prove their guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Captain Jerry Crego said that the 2 suspects denied any involvement, but he referred to them as viable suspects. The 2 were part of a much bigger pool of potential suspects and witnesses and people to interview, but these 2 had apparently been drinking at a bar not far from Cliff Nelson's home. According to reporting in the Missoulian, police quickly zeroed in on a group of young men in their late teens and early 20s who were out drinking at the Saloon Bar right up the road from Cliff's home. Prior to that, they had been out at a party in the woods. Of that group, 2 really became the focus. Of those 2, one of the men allegedly had previously made threatening statements about Mr. Nelson to acquaintances within the past year, and Cliff Nelson had caught wind of them. Cliff Nelson had even confided in a coworker at his summer gig at Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, and he said that he was feeling hesitation returning to Seeley Lake and teaching in the fall because he was having issues with someone there. He didn't elaborate any further to this coworker about the nature of the problems or who the person was. But I think that's relevant to know that he was clearly kind of spooked. Somehow, the Missoulian paper was able to get the following info from the elementary superintendent back in 1996. I don't think this would fly anymore, but the person in question was reportedly expelled from school in 7th or 8th grade, and he had problems with Mr. Nelson and other faculty. This superintendent said, quote, "He had problems in Cliff Nelson's class, but he also had other problems. There were at least 3 incidents that led to him being kicked out. It wasn't just Cliff's class," end quote. There wasn't much in the way of physical evidence to tie these suspects to the case, so they were building a circumstantial case, which is risky, but at the same time, I have to give them credit for trying because at least they're pulling things together to shoot their shot. At this time, just days out from the investigation, here's what police were able to tell the media about what they knew of the corresponding timelines of that night. So we already know that Cliff dropped the students off between 8 and 8:30 after he took them to Pizza Hut, and then he returned to his home. The men in question here, they had been out drinking for a while that night. Altogether, they ended up at what was called the Saloon Bar, and the oldest suspect, who was 21, took some shots of liquor. Things must have gotten rowdy because at around 1 a.m., the group was asked by the bartender to leave the bar. In their interviews with detectives, these men said that they left the bar by themselves, the 21-year-old man on foot because he lived just up the road, and the younger man, who was 19, he said he left in his car. Having said that, a bar patron contradicted this because he said, no, those 2 men left together in the vehicle and they had a shotgun with them. Both suspects were supposedly home by 2 a.m., and the 21-year-old lived across the street in a mobile home himself. He lived across the street from Cliff Nelson's mobile home. Just this little dirt road separated them. And the other person, the 19-year-old, he lived several miles away, and he, had his car. When detectives searched that younger man's car, they did find shotgun shells. But we'll get into that more in a minute and how that can be really tricky to tie back. So yes, things are seeming suspicious with these 2 young men, but police are waiting things out, they're building their case, and so for a bit, the 2 men lived in temporary anonymity. But just a few weeks after the murder, on Saturday, October 19th, a refreshing headline would sprawl across the Missoulian. It read, "Arrested. Seeley Lake men charged with shotgun murder of teacher." The suspects arrested were 19-year-old Rambo Hoosier and 21-year-old Matt Livingston. Hoosier lived with his family about 5 miles away, and Hoosier was the man who was expelled from school and didn't like Cliff Nelson. Matt Livingston, on the other hand, lived across the way from Cliff Nelson with just that little dirt road separating them. At sunup on Friday the 18th, police came pounding on the doors and arrested them. But it wasn't a huge surprise to them. These are the same two suspects that we've been talking about, and they knew that they were in their crosshairs. Having said that, now that they were arrested, police told the media a bit more about what went into their investigation leading up to the arrests. Shortly after Cliff Nelson's murder, detectives learned about a party that was being held nearby that a group of men had been drinking at. They were able to confirm that Rambo Hoosier left the party with Matt Livingston and went to the bar. Livingston at that point, who, remember, lives walking distance to this bar, he had several drinks. He got rowdy, flip a coin on if he was asked to leave. Other reports say that he was complaining about the cost of the drinks and he wanted to leave. Both men expressed that they left separately, Rambo by car, Matt on foot. But then there's that pesky witness who says no, they had a shotgun and they left together in Rambo Hoosier's 1986 white Cadillac. Matt Livingston told investigators he got home at 1:30 or 2. He did have phone records that indicated he called a girl at 1:37 a.m. This woman came forward and said that Matt Livingston sounded drunk and giggly, but he didn't seem upset or mention anything about shooting someone that night. Detectives asked both men, "What was your relationship like with Cliff Nelson?" Matt Livingston said he had no problem with Mr. Nelson. Rambo Hoosier admitted to being expelled, but said he didn't hold a grudge against Mr. Nelson. That does contradict the affidavit of an unnamed informant who stated that Rambo Hoosier has indicated that he did hold a grudge and an intense dislike of Cliff Nelson, and that on multiple occasions Rambo Hoosier implied he would get even with Cliff Nelson and possibly even kill him. Allegedly, of course. Matt Livingston graduated high school, and according to the principal of the high school, he was on a decent enough track. Rambo Hoosier had not graduated high school, but had taken on some part-time jobs as a logger in the area. Pivoting just a bit, I want to talk about the shooting that was tied together from the school window and Cliff's murder, and how that ties back to the suspects at all. Full disclosure, I am not a gun girly, and every time I cover a case with guns involved, I always have to deep dive and make sure I know what I'm talking about. Luckily, the newspaper, The Independent Record, really spells things out for me in this case. So what they said is that a total of 3 gunshots were heard and fired that night, 2 at the school and 1 at Cliff Nelson's trailer. At the scene of Nelson's trailer, they found shot cups from a 12-gauge shotgun. These were found at the school as well. According to the Independent Record quote, detectives found shot cups from a 12-gauge shotgun at the school and Nelson's home. A shot cup holds the small pellets of shot as they move up the barrel of a shotgun. The shot then spreads into a broader pattern as it leaves the barrel. Investigators picked up size 2 steel shot from both locations, but recovered no spent shell casings. It then went on to say that Crego said it's difficult to trace shot cups and steel shot back to a particular weapon, but a firearms expert at the state crime lab has established that the evidence came from a 2 3/4-inch federal shell. So in short, Hoosier had a shotgun and shells similar to this, but they couldn't definitively say it was his gun who fired the shots because shotguns don't imprint unique marks on shot pellets the way that rifles mark bullets. A few weeks after his arrest in November of 1996, Rambo Hoosier pled not guilty to the charges he was facing in connection to Cliff Nelson's murder and the shots fired at the school building. Matt Livingston also maintained his innocence and pled as such. Rambo Hoosier did face additional charges, including felony possession of methamphetamine and misdemeanor possession of drug paraphernalia, based on what was found in his car. At this point, bail was set for both men at $500,000 apiece. The trial for Rambo Hoosier was held in May of 1997, and it got off to a bit of a rough start for the prosecution. There was very little that they were able to bring to the table in terms of physical evidence, and it was a fully circumstantial case. The focus was on the drug and alcohol-fueled party that Rambo Hoosier Matt Livingston and others attended in the hours leading up to Cliff Nelson's death. 3 teens and young adults who attended the gathering at the party spot known as the 4x4 Trail got on the stand to testify. They named others who were there, including 4 young men named John, Jeff, Jesse, and Zach. There were 2 empty bottles of Jim Beam that night, a downed 12-pack of beer, and marijuana. There was also some other drugs mentioned, but that wasn't really proved. According to witnesses, they described most of the partygoers as very intoxicated. Rambo Hoosier's attorney, a man named Craig Shannon, wanted those names being thrown out to be considered as alternate suspects in the case, and he implied that investigators had tunnel vision with his client. One of the witnesses did say they brought John home and that he was passed out from intoxication at the time the murder would have occurred. But the same witness did say that she and others joined some of the other partygoers at the bar and left with even more booze. One thing that makes this complicated is the reliability of witnesses who are all sharing their incredible level of intoxication. That's really tough to stand up in court because how do you know that their timelines and their stories are accurate when they were under the influence? The following day on trial, Missoula County Attorney Robert L. Deschamps III brought forth a different witness. Not a drunk partygoer this time, but the person who said that Rambo Hoosier had made threats about Cliff Nelson to him. The witness was a person named Shannon Rammel. According to Rammel's testimony, Rambo Hoosier allegedly told him that he wanted to, quote, blow his effing head off, end quote. And I should clarify, he wanted to blow Cliff Nelson's head off, not Shannon's. This was, however, over 5 years ago, as it turned out, which is confusing. That does get confusing because there was definitely a signed affidavit from someone else who said it happened recently. So I somewhat get the impression that Hoosier had kind of made these statements about Cliff Nelson to several people over the years, but possibly this is just who they could get on the witness stand. I don't know for sure. That's just my own speculation. Because otherwise the timelines and when these threats were made doesn't really add up across all the different reporting forums. Shannon Rammel went on to say that he didn't think that Hoosier meant what he said at the time, but when Mr. Nelson turned up dead, he immediately thought of this conversation. He was initially nervous to come forward, but when he saw the town's grief, he summoned his courage to say something. The following day of the trial, it didn't get much better for the prosecution. They pulled out a jailhouse informant who was a former cellmate of Rambo Hoosier's while he was awaiting trial, and he claimed that Hoosier told him that he killed Cliff Nelson and that he wouldn't be caught for it, which is a weird thing to say when you're sitting in jail caught for it. But yeah. Anyways, Missoula County Sheriff's Captain Jerry Krega was grilled by Rambo Hoosier's attorney Craig Shannon, and he admitted they didn't have a ton to go on in terms of physical evidence in this case. Over the course of the trial, they had tried to bring in other evidence too, but it was just really thin. One of the examples was someone who had heard a car pull away from the high school after the shots were fired through the window, and it was said that it sounded like Hoosier's Cadillac. So they were really bringing in sound of cars in as evidence. On May 31st, 1997, another headline would hit the papers, one that would have a very different impact than the first. This one would read, Hoosier not guilty. A preponderant lack of evidence leads to acquittal. The 6-man, 6-woman jury took just 2.5 hours to reach their verdict to acquit Hoosier. The contrast of the reactions in the courtroom were visible. Rambo Hoosier's family and friends were hugging and high-fiving, while Cliff Nelson's family cried and hung their heads. According to the Missoulian, Rambo's father, Tip Hoosier, extended his sympathy to the Nelson clan, saying, quote, I'm just so sorry for you all. Cliff Nelson was a great, great man. I hope they find who did this. One family member responded, give us a break, while another simply just said, thank you. At this juncture, after a nightmare trial for the prosecution, they dropped all charges against the co-defendant, Matt Livingston. One of Cliff's sisters, Elaine Anderson, told the press that the family was somewhat expecting this. In her opinion, it was possible they had the right person, but the case was just too hard. She said that the family would try to pull together because they were a strong family and they had to find a way to move forward. The jury foreman reported that many in the jury didn't find the cellmate credible. He said they just felt they didn't have enough evidence to convict Rambo Hoosier beyond a reasonable doubt. And to his credit, defense attorney Craig Shannon did what he was paid to do. According to reporting in the Great Falls Tribune, he helped cast that doubt on the cellmate credibility, even with the prosecution bringing up the risk taken by this person, because snitches are not viewed great in prison. Craig Shannon also slammed the prosecution for their claim that Cliff Nelson would have had to have been shot by a relatively tall man, which was clearly a nod in the direction of the 6-foot, 6-inch tall Rambo Hoosier. A firearms expert for the state crime lab testified that anybody 5 foot 9 inches or taller could have been the shooter. So I guess that does give some information, but tall is kind of how you interpret it. The acquittal weighed heavily on the Sealy Lake community, and the rumor mill began. All of the men who were out partying that night were said to have had a reputation in the community, and that many in the community were intimidated and fearful of this crowd. They had breathed a collective sigh of relief when the 2 men were arrested. In fact, even a local gas station had put up a sign announcing the arrests. But with the acquittal, they felt fearful again. Missoula County Attorney Robert Deschamps said he had been hesitant about the case he was bringing forth. He had hoped that maybe the co-defendant would turn on Rambo Hoosier, but that never happened. On the flip side, one local bar celebrated the acquittal and hosted a welcome home party. So this just kind of shows how polarized this small community was at this time and about this crime. One local told the Missoulian, quote, "There are people who will never go back to that bar now, and there's people who will probably never speak to one another again. It's the sort of thing where you line up on one side or the other. It's not very healthy, probably, but it's nothing new for us up here," end quote. People frantic with the verdict called for a heavier police presence to what they felt was a growing crime problem in their small town. So the Missoula County Sheriff placed a 3rd deputy in the town. But he said that the town gave a rather push and pull relationship to the sheriff's department. Some folks wanted them there, and some wanted them to go back to Missoula and not be in town. And the sheriff said that the town was like this on many issues. Underage drinking was an example, so he said there would be this outrage that police needed to do more about it, so they'd break up a party and cite kids for underage drinking, and then those same people would be upset that they cited the kids. A couple of teachers who wanted to remain anonymous, which, by the way, is a huge theme in this case. Nobody wants to say anything on the record because everyone is terrified. But these teachers called the Missoulian after the verdict was handed down, and they said, "Look, most of our kids are great, but there is a huge drug and alcohol problem in our school district, and it's starting in the homes." I want to read the quote to you that the teacher said to the paper because I think it paints a really clear picture. The person said, quote, "We've got a major problem in the high school. We've got kids who have no guidance at home. We've got students whose parents condone drugs and alcohol. When you're not concerned that your 14-year-old is drunk and sleeping with her boyfriend, you're not a responsible parent. And I can tell you what that parent will say to us. They'll say, 'Don't tell me how to raise my kids.' There's a drug culture here, and that culture is part and parcel of the crime problem that this town has. There's a sort of amoral, law of the jungle atmosphere with this group of people. These kids who were running around with Rambo when Cliff was killed, they just don't believe that there are any consequences to their actions. They just don't care about anyone," end quote. I'm not going to lie, if I was a teacher in this district, I'd start to feel nervous after what happened to Cliff. Missoula County Attorney Robert Deschamps had this to say to the paper about the community of Sealy Lake. He said, quote, "Look at the murders and some of the crimes we've got in outlying areas. We've got a bunch of dysfunctional folks living up there. I'm not saying it's everybody, not at all, but you've got people who've moved out there to get away from rules. They're out there with marginal incomes, marginal employment, no education, and they throw up a tar paper shack or a tumble-down trailer and just do whatever they please. That's a recipe for trouble," end quote. This is probably a good time to throw in that disclaimer of views expressed on this podcast are their own and don't necessarily represent mine. I say that just because I had a knee-jerk reaction to dismiss him a little bit when I read that, because I want to step away from stereotyping, which is what I feel like he was kind of doing in this quote. because people live in trailers or live a modest life or have a lower income or education, that doesn't make them criminals at all. It does not make them dysfunctional. And I want to avoid being classist in these sweeping statements. However, we do have to be realistic that we know objectively that socioeconomic factors contribute heavily to prevalence of crime and just general outcomes for people. So I do think if you separate out his quote a bit, there is some validity to it that sometimes people do move to these more off-the-grid locations to avoid the rules and avoid getting in trouble. And when you fuel all sorts of things in there, like heavy drug use and alcohol into that, yes, I agree with him there. That is a recipe for trouble. And to give you an idea, that tiny area had 5 murders in 6 years. That's just a lot for that tiny of a space and population. One of the teachers who spoke to the Missoulian that June said, quote, "Sealy Lake has lost 2 special things here, Cliff Nelson and our innocents. We can't get them back, but we can't just give in either." So at this point, the town is still fragmented. It's still feeling this kind of vibe of lawlessness just sitting out there. But in a way, they're trying to pull together. And they still want answers in Cliff Nelson's murder because it's not solved. Just a little over a week out from the not guilty verdict, another surprising incident happened. Someone broke into the Hoosier trailer and assaulted Tip Hoosier, Rambo Hoosier's father, while he was sleeping. Police deputies stumbled into the crime, possibly in progress. They had come to the trailer to talk to Rambo Hoosier and a friend who they suspected may have had involvement or knowledge of an automobile accident they were looking into. But Rambo and his friend were actually outside in this tent that was on the property. The police saw another figure inside the house who wouldn't open the door. The next part is a little fuzzy, but they somehow make entry and they find Tip Hoosier, and the second person is just gone. That person has not been identified to my knowledge. I couldn't find anything else about it, and they certainly didn't know who it was at the time. They had no idea if Tip Hoosier's assault was related to his son's acquittal and Cliff Nelson or something totally different. Months passed, and finally the 1-year mark of Cliff Nelson's murder came. The town was still shook. A scholarship fund was put together in his name. The boy whose band he donated his coaching stipend to, they played music in his honor. And a candlelight vigil was held. And that same group of kids who all the rumors surrounded, they continued to make trouble. The same sawed-off shotgun that had first been entered as evidence in the Rambo Hoosier trial again resurfaced in conversation in October of 1997. 2 of the men who had testified in Rambo's trial and had been partying that night, Zach and John, they were charged with possession of that shotgun that month. I was confused when I first read this, so let me give you the backstory. According to the Missoulian, John was charged with making the gun, possessing it while being an unlawful drug user. Zach was charged with 2 possession counts, and this all came to fruition back at the trial when Rambo Hoosier's attorney found out about that gun and that John had made it and asked Zach to hide it while the Nelson murder was being investigated and going on. Zach did lead investigators to the gun, which he had been hiding up on this mountain. And for the record, the firearms expert for the state did say this particular weapon couldn't have been the murder weapon. But still illegal, still can't have it, so there we are. The acquittal took the wind out of the sails for any resolution on Cliff's case. It's possible that it wasn't one of those kids partying that night. It's very possible that it was. Maybe the right person went on trial, and maybe not. You do wonder if the person who Cliff Nelson was referencing when he said he was having problems with someone in town and he was talking to his summer colleague, you wonder if that person is the same person who killed him and if it was one of these kids. What you will find if you go on forums and listen to community chatter, the consensus is everyone in this town knows who did this, it's an open secret, and people are scared to come forward. Given all of this, I personally believe it will be difficult for people to come forward without some sort of assurance that they will be safe. And I mean, the crowd that surrounded this case, they're just in their late 40s now. They're still young. My understanding is many of them still live there. Many of Cliff's family members have passed away, but he still has people who mourn his death and who want answers, including those who loved him in the small town of Sealy Lake. I want to end this episode by sharing a little clip of a letter Cliff Nelson wrote to his students that were seniors, about to embark on their journey into adulthood. It read in part, quote, "Be good, sometimes. Play fair, stop by, not every day, and don't forget to hold hands when you cross the street." If you have any information on the murder of Cliff Nelson, please contact the Missoula County Tip Line at 406-258-3302. Thank you for joining me for another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. Don't forget to go follow me and subscribe, and I'll be back next week with another case, so be sure to tune in on Monday.